That morning, the Seattle rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our 20th floor office, each droplet exploding like tiny grenades against the glass. I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the city blur into watercolor streaks below. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd always loved the rain. It reminded me of fresh starts, of washing away the old to make room for something new. I had no idea that in 3 hours, my entire life would be washed away too. My name is Marcus Chen, and at 32, I thought I had everything figured out. TechFlow Innovations wasn't just a company to me. It was my child, my dream made manifest in glass and steel. What started as late-night coding sessions in my stepbrother's garage had evolved into a cutting-edge software firm specializing in artificial intelligence solutions for healthcare. We employed 47 people, held 12 patents, and our client list read like a who's who of major hospitals and medical research facilities. The journey to this moment had been built on sacrifice and sleepless nights. I remembered the early days vividly, cramped in David's garage in Kirkland, surrounded by empty pizza boxes and energy drink cans, our breath visible in the cold Pacific Northwest air because we couldn't afford heating. David would be on his phone, sweet-talking potential investors with promises of revolutionary technology, while I hunched over my laptop, actually building that technology line by line. Those were the days when we truly felt like brothers. When David would bring me coffee at 3 a.m, watching over my shoulder as I debugged complex algorithms. When we'd celebrate every small victory, our first client, our first patent approval, our first office lease, with cheap champagne and dreams that felt larger than the city skyline stretching beyond David's garage window. I'd been 28 then, fresh from dropping out of my PhD program at the University of Washington. My mother, Rebecca, had been furious, but David had convinced me that we were onto something revolutionary. Academic research moves too slowly, he'd said. While you're writing papers, people are dying from misdiagnoses that our technology could prevent. He'd been right, of course. That's what made his eventual betrayal so much more devastating. The technology we developed wasn't just innovative, it was transformative. Medassist could process medical imaging, lab results, patient histories, and symptom reports simultaneously, cross-referencing against databases of millions of similar cases to provide diagnostic suggestions with unprecedented accuracy. Emergency room doctors could upload a patient's data and receive potential diagnoses ranked by probability within minutes. Radiologists could catch cancers that human eyes might miss. General practitioners in rural areas could access the diagnostic power of specialists at major medical centers. But the real breakthrough had come 18 months into our partnership, during one of those marathon coding sessions that had become our signature. I'd been working on improving the pattern recognition algorithms when I discovered a way to integrate real-time genetic data analysis into the diagnostic process. It was a leap forward that would allow personalized medicine on a scale never before possible. I remember the exact moment the solution clicked into place. It was 4:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, rain drumming steadily on the garage roof. David had fallen asleep on the old couch his mother had donated to our makeshift office, snoring softly under a Seattle Seahawks blanket. I'd been staring at code for so long that the characters were blurring together, when suddenly the pattern emerged like a hidden image in a stereogram. "David," I'd whispered, shaking his shoulder. "David, wake up! I've got it." He'd sat up, instantly alert in that way that had always impressed me. "Got what?" "The genetic integration. I know how to make Medassist analyze DNA markers in real time alongside traditional diagnostic data. This isn't just diagnostic software anymore. This is the future of personalized medicine." We'd stayed awake until dawn, mapping out the implications. Patients could receive treatment plans tailored not just to their symptoms, but to their specific genetic predispositions. Cancer treatments could be customized based on tumor genetics and patient DNA. Drug dosages could be optimized to individual metabolic profiles. It was the kind of breakthrough that comes along once in a generation. That morning, as the sun rose over Lake Washington, David had looked at me with something approaching awe. "Marcus," he'd said, "we're going to change the world." And for a while, it had seemed like we would. The we in that equation was myself and my stepbrother, David Sterling. David, 2 years older and blessed with the kind of charisma that made investors open their checkbooks without reading the fine print. David, who could schmooze with venture capitalists over expensive wine while I buried myself in code, solving problems that shouldn't have solutions. David, who shared my mother Rebecca's maiden name after she married his father when I was 12. Our relationship hadn't always been easy. When Rebecca married Harold Sterling, I'd been a grieving kid still processing my father's death 2 years earlier. David, at 14, had been dealing with his own trauma. His mother had died of breast cancer when he was 10, leaving Harold to raise him alone. We were two broken kids trying to form a family from the wreckage of our individual losses. Harold had been patient with both of us, understanding that brotherhood couldn't be forced, but had to grow naturally. He'd taken us camping in the Cascades, teaching us to fish and hike, creating shared experiences that slowly built trust between David and me. Rebecca, with her infinite capacity for love, had embraced David as completely as if he'd been her biological son, while never trying to replace the mother he'd lost. By the time we graduated high school, David from the prestigious Lakeside School, me from the public Roosevelt High, we'd genuinely become brothers. Different personalities, different strengths, but united by shared ambition and complementary skills. David was the natural leader, the one who could inspire people to follow him into uncertain ventures. I was the problem solver, the one who could turn David's grand visions into tangible reality. Harold had encouraged our partnership from the beginning. He'd seen something in our dynamic that reminded him of successful business partnerships from his own construction company. "You boys balance each other," he'd say during our Sunday family dinners. "David dreams big, Marcus builds solid. That's a powerful combination if you can keep it working." We'd keep it working for 8 years. 8 years of building something extraordinary together, of late nights and early mornings, of shared successes and mutual support. 8 years of believing that family meant something more than blood, that brotherhood was stronger than greed, that trust was sacred and unbreakable. I should have remembered that Harold had also taught us about contracts, about putting important agreements in writing, about protecting yourself even from people you love. But when you trust someone completely, when you've shared dreams and struggles and victories, you start to believe that such precautions are unnecessary. You start to believe that love is enough. We made a perfect team, or so I believed. I was the brain, he was the face. I built the technology that would revolutionize how medical data was processed and analyzed. He sold it to the world. Our AI diagnostic tool, MedAssist, could analyze patient symptoms and medical histories with 97% accuracy, faster than any human doctor. It was going to save lives. It was going to make us rich. It was going to be our legacy. The rain intensified as I turned away from the window, my reflection ghost-like in the glass. Our office space buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Developers hunched over their monitors, their faces illuminated by endless streams of code. The marketing team clustered around their conference table, pointing at charts and graphs that showed our meteoric rise. Everyone believed in what we were building. Everyone trusted that David and I would lead them to prosperity. I should have been happy. We were 3 weeks away from the biggest presentation of our lives. A pitch to MedCorp International, a pharmaceutical giant that could catapult us from successful startup to industry leader overnight. The contract was worth $87 million over 5 years. $87 million that would secure not just our future, but the futures of everyone who had believed in us. My assistant Sarah knocked on my door, her usual bright smile dimmed by concern. "Marcus, David wants to see you in the conference room. He said it's urgent." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. Sarah had worked with us since the early days, when our biggest worry was whether we could afford decent coffee for the office. She knew the rhythms of our business like a conductor knows a symphony. When Sarah looked worried, there was reason to worry. I made my way through the open plan office, nodding to my team members, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The conference room sat at the far end of our floor, its glass walls usually transparent, today frosted for privacy. Through the opaque glass, I could see David's silhouette, along with two others I didn't recognize. As I walked, I noticed details that my anxiety was cataloging with photographic precision. Miguel Santos, our lead AI developer, glanced up from his screen with a worried expression that quickly shifted to forced casualness when he saw me. Jenny Morrison from marketing was on her phone, but her conversation seemed strained, her usual animated gestures replaced by nervous finger-tapping on her desk. Even the office atmosphere felt different. The familiar hum of productivity overlaid with an undercurrent of tension that made the hair on my neck stand up. Sarah's desk was clean, too clean. Usually cluttered with project files and coffee cups, today it looked like it had been deliberately organized. She wasn't at her workstation, which was unusual for a Tuesday morning when she typically prepped for our weekly strategy meetings. Another red flag in a day that was rapidly accumulating them. The walk to the conference room felt like a death march, each step carrying me closer to a confrontation I couldn't yet understand but instinctively dreaded. The corridor that had once felt like a pathway to success now felt like a gauntlet, lined with the achievements David and I had built together. Framed patent certificates, photos from industry conferences, awards from medical technology organizations. One photo caught my eye as I passed. David and me at the Healthcare Innovation Summit last year, both grinning as we held the Breakthrough Technology Award for Medicist. David's arm was slung around my shoulders, and we looked like the successful partnership we'd believed ourselves to be. The irony was sharp enough to cut, that award now hanging like a monument to naivety in the hallway where my professional execution was about to take place. My hand hesitated on the door handle. In that moment, some primitive part of my brain screamed warnings I was too civilized to heed. The polished brass felt cold under my palm, and I noticed my reflection in the metal, distorted, fragmented, like a funhouse mirror showing a future I couldn't yet comprehend. But partnership, like family, is built on trust. And trust, I was about to learn, can be the most dangerous foundation of all. I pushed open the door to find David seated at the head of our conference table, flanked by two men in expensive suits. One was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of presence that spoke of boardrooms and power lunches. The other was younger, sharp-eyed, clutching a leather portfolio like a weapon. Neither smiled when I entered. "Marcus," David said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar formality. "Please, sit down." I remained standing. "What's this about, David? Who are these gentlemen?" The silver-haired man spoke first. "Mr. Chen, I'm Richard Blackstone, senior partner at Blackstone Morrison Associates. This is my associate, James Morton. We represent Mr. Sterling in certain legal matters." Legal matters. The words hit me like ice water. "Legal matters, David, what the hell is going on?" David couldn't meet my eyes. Instead, he stared at his hands, folded on the table like he was praying or confessing. "Marcus, there's no easy way to say this. The board has voted to remove you from your position as Chief Technology Officer, effective immediately." The room tilted. I gripped the back of the chair to steady myself. "The board? What board? We're equal partners. We make decisions together." James Morton, the younger lawyer, slid a document across the table. "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate, Mr. Chen. According to the corporate filing documents, Mr. Sterling holds 51% of the company shares, giving him controlling interest." I stared at the papers without comprehending. The numbers and legal jargon blurred together like rain on a windshield. "That's impossible. We split everything 50-50 from the beginning. I have the original partnership agreement." "The original agreement was superseded," Blackstone said coolly, "when the company was formally incorporated 18 months ago. At that time, Mr. Sterling's financial contributions were deemed to exceed yours, warranting majority control." "Financial contributions?" My voice cracked like a teenager's. "I've put every penny I had in company. I've worked 18-hour days for 4 years. I created Medicist. I hold the patents." That's when David finally looked up, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood freeze. Not guilt, not regret. Calculation. Cold, clinical calculation. "Actually, Marcus," he said quietly, "you don't hold the patents. The company does. And as majority shareholder, I control the company." The room spun. I sat down hard, the chair wheeling slightly under my weight. "You can't do this. We built this together. We're family." "Family?" David's laugh was bitter. You always loved throwing that word around, didn't you? Family doesn't keep score, you'd say. Family shares everything equally. Well, this is business, Marcus, and in business, family is a luxury we can't afford. Morton slid another document across the table. Your severance package is quite generous, Mr. Chen. 6 months' salary plus a confidentiality agreement that ensures. Fuck your severance package. I stood so fast the chair rolled backward and hit the wall. You want to steal my company? Fine, but you'll be hearing from my lawyer. Blackstone's smile was predatory. I wouldn't recommend that course of action, Mr. Chen. You signed over the patent rights when the company was incorporated. Any legal challenge would be both expensive and unsuccessful. I never signed over any patent rights. Check your incorporation documents more carefully, David said. Page 17, subsection C. You signed them, Marcus. You just didn't read them thoroughly enough. The words hit me like physical blows. Page 17, subsection C. I remembered that day, the stack of legal documents David had presented with a casual shrug. Just formalities, he'd said. Lawyers being lawyers, sign here, here, and here. I'd trusted him. I'd trusted my stepbrother with everything. Security appeared in the doorway. 2 guards I didn't recognize, their presence making the betrayal complete. Mr. Chen, one of them said politely, we'll need to escort you out. You can collect your personal belongings under supervision. I looked at David one last time, searching his face for any trace of the man who'd coded beside me through countless all-nighters, who'd celebrated our first major contract with champagne on the office roof, who'd called me brother. I found nothing but a stranger wearing David's face. The MedCorp presentation, I said, grasping at straws. You need me for the MedCorp presentation. I wrote the technical specifications. I designed the algorithms. Actually, David said, we won't be moving forward with MedCorp. We've accepted a different offer. Pharmatech Industries has agreed to acquire our technology for $92 million. The deal closes next week. Pharmatech, MedCorp's biggest competitor. The company that had tried to poach me 6 months ago with an offer I'd laughingly declined. The company that would have paid twice what MedCorp offered if only they could get their hands on our proprietary algorithms. You sold us out, I whispered. You sold out everything we built. I sold smart, David replied. Sometimes the biggest risk is not taking the risk at all. The walk through the office was a parade of shame. My colleagues, my friends, watched in stunned silence as security flanked me to my desk. The scene felt surreal, like watching myself in a movie where I didn't know the script. Sarah was crying quietly at her workstation, tears streaming down her face as she pretended to organize files. Miguel, our lead AI developer, stood with his mouth open like he was witnessing a car crash, his coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips. Jenny from marketing started to approach, then stopped when one of the guards shook his head with bureaucratic authority. The worst part wasn't the humiliation, it was the confusion in their eyes. These people had worked with David and me for years, had seen us finish each other's sentences in meetings, had watched us debate technical details with the passion of people who genuinely cared about each other's opinions. To them, we weren't just business partners. We were the founding brotherhood that had built something meaningful together. Alex Chen, no relation, despite the shared surname, stepped forward from the development team. Marcus, what's happening? David called an all-hands meeting for this afternoon, but nobody understands what's going on. One of the security guards, a heavy-set man with the kind of face that had seen too many of these scenes, placed a restraining hand on Alex's shoulder. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back. It's okay, Alex, I managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. I'll explain everything later. But even as I said it, I wondered if I'd ever get the chance. If David was capable of this level of betrayal, what else might he be planning? Would there be legal challenges to prevent me from starting a competing company? Non-compete clauses I'd forgotten signing? I was beginning to realize how little I actually knew about the legal structure of the company I'd helped build. I packed my personal belongings in a cardboard box, a photo of my mother taken last Christmas, her arm around both David and me in front of Harold's fireplace, a coffee mug from our first trade show where we'd barely had enough money for the booth rental, the stress ball Sarah had given me for my birthday, shaped like a brain with "Think Happy Thoughts" printed on it. a small cactus plant that had somehow survived 4 years of my neglect, my backup laptop charger, and a framed copy of our first patent certificate, something I'd insisted on printing and displaying as a reminder of what we'd accomplished. 4 years of my life reduced to objects that could fit in a container meant for Amazon deliveries. 4 years of 18-hour days, sacrificed relationships, missed family gatherings, deferred dreams, all of it suddenly belonging to David alone. As we reached the elevator, I turned back to see David watching from his office doorway. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe it was just relief that the messy business was finally over. The elevator doors closed on my career, my company, my future. In the polished steel, I saw my reflection, disheveled, shell-shocked, holding a cardboard box like a refugee from my own life. The man staring back at me looked like a stranger. Maybe that's because the Marcus Chen who had entered the building that morning no longer existed. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and threatening. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the building that had been my second home. 20 floors up, behind windows that reflected nothing but sky, my life's work continued without me. My code, my innovations, my dreams, all of it proceeding under David's name. I pulled out my phone to call my lawyer, then stopped. Blackstone's words echoed in my memory, expensive and unsuccessful. Corporate law wasn't my area of expertise, but I knew enough to understand that without clear documentation of my claims, I'd be fighting an uphill battle against a well-funded opponent. Instead, I called my mother. "Marcus, honey, shouldn't you be at work?" Rebecca's voice carried the warmth that had sustained me through every challenge since childhood. In the background, I could hear the familiar sounds of her design studio, the soft jazz she always played while working, the scratch of pencil on paper as she sketched room layouts, the distant hum of Seattle traffic from her Pike Place Market area office. "Mom," I said, and my voice broke on the word, "I need to come home." There was a long pause, the kind that spans generations of understanding between a mother and child. Rebecca had raised me to be strong, to solve my own problems, to never give up. She'd taught me that Chen men faced adversity with dignity and determination. Hearing her successful son calling home in defeat would alarm her more than any emergency room call. "What happened, baby?" The endearment she hadn't used since I was a teenager told me she understood this was serious. I told her everything: the betrayal, the legal maneuvering, the cold professionalism with which my stepbrother had erased me from the company we'd built together. Rebecca listened without interruption, the way she had when I was 8 years old and came home bloody from playground fights with kids who called me names for being different. "That bastard," she whispered, and I was shocked to hear my gentle mother use profanity. Rebecca Chen Sterling was a woman who believed in proper language and measured responses, who had taught me that emotional control was a sign of strength. For her to curse meant David's betrayal had cut deeper than professional disappointment. It had wounded the family she'd worked so hard to build. "Mom, please don't blame yourself for—" "Don't you dare," she interrupted, her voice fierce with protective anger. "Don't you dare apologize for his betrayal. Harold would be devastated if he knew what David had done. We raised those boys to be brothers, to support each other. This isn't your fault, Marcus. This is a choice David made, and it's a choice that would break his father's heart." Her words cracked something open inside me, and I found myself sobbing in the parking garage of the building where I'd just lost everything. The tears came in waves: grief for the partnership I'd believed in, rage at the betrayal, fear for an uncertain future, and underneath it all, a deep sadness for the loss of the brother I'd thought I had. "Come home," she said finally. "We'll figure this out together. And Marcus, bring Harold's legal documents from the safe. I have a feeling we're going to need them." The drive to my childhood home in Bellevue gave me time to think, which proved to be dangerous. Every mile brought fresh realizations of how thoroughly I'd been outmaneuvered. David hadn't just stolen my company. He'd planned it methodically, probably for months. The incorporation papers, the board structure, the timing of the acquisition offer, none of it was coincidental. The familiar route from downtown Seattle to Bellevue had always been a comforting transition, from the urban intensity of the tech corridor to the tree-lined streets where I'd learned to ride a bike and thrown my first baseball. Today, the journey felt like traveling backward through time, from the successful entrepreneur I'd believed myself to be, to the uncertain young man who'd left this house 8 years ago with nothing but ambition and trust. I'd been so focused on building the future that I'd failed to protect the present. While I'd been perfecting algorithms and debugging code, David had been playing a different game entirely, chess while I was playing checkers. It was a humbling realization that cut deeper than the financial loss. I'd been naive in a way that felt almost childish now. Lake Washington stretched beside the highway, its surface choppy from the wind that always preceded serious rain in this part of the Pacific Northwest. The water was steel gray, reflecting the sullen sky, and I found myself thinking about the metaphors Harold used to share during our weekend fishing trips. "Business is like weather," he'd say, casting his line into the lake's depths. "You can prepare for it, but you can't control it. The smart man builds shelters before the storm hits." I'd thought TechFlow was my shelter. I'd thought partnership with David was my insurance against professional disaster. Instead, I'd built my house on sand, trusting that family meant something more than legal documents and share percentages. The Bellevue exit came up faster than expected, and I realized I'd been driving on autopilot, my mind cycling through the day's events like a broken record. The tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood looked exactly the same. Perfectly manicured lawns, expensive cars and circular driveways, the kind of understated wealth that characterized this corner of the Seattle metropolitan area. But everything felt different now, viewed through the lens of failure and betrayal. Harold's house, Rebecca's house now, sat at the end of Maple Lane, a craftsman-style home that spoke of stability and permanence. Harold had designed it himself back in the 1990s, incorporating elements from the Frank Lloyd Wright homes he'd admired during a trip to Chicago. Low-slung roof lines, natural materials, large windows that invited the forest inside. It was a house built by someone who understood the importance of creating sanctuary. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed Rebecca's Lexus was parked alongside a car I didn't recognize, a dark blue BMW with Oregon plates. My stomach clenched with the possibility that she'd called David, that this was some kind of family intervention designed to smooth over the conflict. But as I sat in my car, gathering courage to face whatever waited inside, I saw the front door open and Rebecca emerge alone, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light that filtered through the Douglas firs surrounding the property. My mother was waiting on the porch when I arrived, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light. Rebecca Chen Sterling was 71 years old and still possessed the fierce intelligence that had helped her build a successful interior design business from nothing. She'd immigrated from Taiwan with my father when I was 2, worked double shifts to put herself through night school, and raised me alone after Dad died in a car accident when I was 10. She hugged me without words, the way mothers do when their children are broken and need fixing. Only after we were inside, sitting at the kitchen table where I'd done homework and eaten countless meals, did she speak. "Tell me about the patents," she said. I pulled out my laptop and showed her the incorporation documents, pointing to the offending clause that had signed away my intellectual property rights. Rebecca read slowly, her finger tracing each line of legal text. "You didn't have your own lawyer review this?" David said it was just a formality. He said his lawyer had handled everything properly. "David's lawyer," she repeated. "Not your lawyer. Not our lawyer. David's lawyer." The emphasis stung because it highlighted my naivety. Of course David's lawyer would protect David's interests. Of course I should have had independent legal counsel. Of course I'd been an idiot to trust family in a business deal worth millions. "There's something else," Rebecca said, disappearing into her study. She returned with a manila folder thick with documents. "Your stepfather left these for you." Harold Sterling had died 3 years earlier from a heart attack, sudden and shocking. He'd been a good stepfather, never trying to replace my father, but always there when I needed guidance. I'd been too busy with the company to go through his personal effects properly. The folder contained financial documents, investment records, and correspondence with his lawyer. but it was the handwritten letter on top that made my hands shake as I read it. Marcus, the letter began in Harold's careful script, the same handwriting that had signed birthday cards and graduation checks. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and Rebecca thought you needed to see these documents. I've watched you and David work together over the years, and while I'm proud of both my sons, I've grown concerned about certain differences in your approaches to business and family. You remember our fishing trips to Lake Chelan? How I used to tell you boys that the biggest fish are caught by the most patient fishermen? David was always the one, trying new lures, new techniques, eager for the quick strike. You were the one who would study the water, understand the patterns, wait for the right moment. Both approaches have merit, but David's impatience has been growing, and I've noticed him watching you with calculating eyes when he thinks nobody is looking. Last month, when you showed me the genetic integration breakthrough, David asked me privately about accelerating our exit strategy. He wanted to know about acquisition possibilities, about maximizing shareholder value, about what I called premature harvesting. When I asked him what you thought about selling the company, he said you weren't ready to think about it yet, that you were too focused on the technology to understand business realities. That conversation worried me, son. Not because selling is wrong, every business needs an exit strategy, but because David was already thinking about exit without including you in the conversation. Partners don't make unilateral decisions about the future. Brothers don't keep secrets that affect the family. You should know that I've been quietly investing in your company since the beginning, not through David, but through a trust I established in your name. The legal documents in this folder establish you as the sole beneficiary of a trust that owns 15% of TechFlow Innovations. David doesn't know about this trust, and neither does his mother. I intended to tell you both when you were older and more established, but life had other plans. The trust was designed to activate only under certain circumstances, specifically if you were ever removed from the company or if your ownership stake was threatened. My lawyer, Richard Hawthorne at Hawthorne & Associates, has instructions to contact you if these conditions are met. His number is on the business card attached to this letter. I've also included documentation of additional safeguards. Any intellectual property you developed, regardless of corporate assignments, remains yours personally under the trust provisions. I learned this protection from my own father, who lost his construction innovations to a partner who thought blood was thicker than business sense. Sometimes it's the opposite, Marcus. Sometimes business sense is what protects the blood. I hope you never need to use this information, but if you do, know that it comes with my love and my faith in your integrity. You're a good man, Marcus, perhaps too good for the business world. But sometimes being good isn't enough. Sometimes you need to be smart too. Remember what I taught you about building foundations. They have to be stronger than what they support, and they have to be built to last longer than the man who builds them. I built this foundation for you because I saw something in your partnership that reminded me of my own youth, when I trusted too easily and paid the price. Don't make my mistakes, son. Don't let goodness become weakness. And remember that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to protect the people who would protect you. With all my love and hopes for your future, Harold Sterling, your stepfather, but more importantly, your father in all the ways that matter. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Harold had seen this coming. He'd recognized something in David's character that I'd been too trusting to notice, and he'd built a safety net without anyone knowing it existed. The man who'd taught me to fish and drive and throw a curveball had also taught me a final lesson about protecting yourself from people you love. Did you know about this? I asked my mother. Rebecca shook her head. Harold mentioned setting up some kind of trust, but he said it was just precautionary. I didn't realize it was this significant. I called Richard Hawthorne immediately. His secretary informed me that Mr. Hawthorne was in court, but would return my call within the hour. The wait was agony, made worse by the growing realization that David and his lawyers might have made a critical error. When Hawthorne called back, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to delivering important news. Mr. Chen, I've been expecting your call. Harold's instructions were very specific about the conditions that would trigger the trust activation. Based on what you've told me, those conditions appear to have been met. What does this mean for the Pharmatech acquisition? It means, Hawthorne said with what sounded like satisfaction, that any sale of the company requires approval from all shareholders holding more than 10% of the stock. Without your consent as trustee, the acquisition cannot proceed. The implications hit me like lightning. David had orchestrated my removal and lined up a buyer, but he couldn't complete the sale without my signature. The very trust he didn't know existed would block the deal that was supposed to make him rich. There's more, Hawthorne continued. Harold's trust document includes specific provisions about fair valuation in the event of acquisition offers. Any sale must be conducted through independent appraisal and open bidding. If Mr. Sterling has negotiated an exclusive deal with Pharmatech, he's violated his fiduciary duty to minority shareholders. What are my options? Several. We could seek an injunction to block the sale. We could demand a board seat and independent audit of the company's financials. Or, and here Hawthorne's voice took on a predatory edge, we could let them proceed with their plans just far enough to establish clear evidence of their misconduct, then bring a lawsuit that would make their acquisition deal look like pocket change. I chose option 3. The next morning, I called David directly. His secretary tried to deflect me, but I insisted it was urgent and personal. When he finally picked up, his voice carried the strained politeness of someone talking to an unwelcome relative at a funeral. Marcus, I thought we'd covered everything yesterday. If this is about the severance package, it's not about the severance, I said. I've been thinking about what you said, about family being a luxury in business. You're right. There was a long pause. What do you mean? I mean, I want to congratulate you on the Pharmatech deal. $92 million is impressive, much better than what MedCorp was offering. Marcus, I hope you understand this wasn't personal. It was just business. I know, and that's why I'm calling. I want to make sure the deal goes through smoothly, no complications. Another pause, longer this time. David was too smart not to be suspicious of my sudden cooperation, but too greedy to examine my motives too closely. I appreciate that, Marcus. I really do. The only thing is, I'll need to review the sale documents, just to make sure everything is properly handled. Professional curiosity. Marcus, you're no longer with the company. I can't share confidential acquisition documents with... David, I interrupted. We both know I have certain, let's call them relationships with some of your biggest clients. It would be unfortunate if any of them started questioning the stability of their AI provider right in the middle of a major acquisition. It was a bluff, but it was based on truth. I'd personally cultivated relationships with the CTOs and medical directors at most of our major accounts. One phone call from me raising concerns about the company's future could torpedo months of sales work. What exactly are you asking for? Just the basic deal structure. Purchase price, payment terms, transition timeline, the kind of information that would be public after the acquisition anyway. David agreed, reluctantly, to email me a summary of the acquisition terms. What I received was even better than I'd hoped, a detailed breakdown of the purchase price allocation, including specific valuations for our patent portfolio, customer contracts, and physical assets. I forwarded everything to Hawthorne, who called me back within hours, barely containing his excitement. Marcus, this is beautiful. They valued the patent portfolio at $38 million, almost half the total purchase price. But according to the corporate documents you signed, those patents are owned by the company, not by you personally. Right, that's how David stole them from me. Except, Hawthorne continued, Harold's trust documents include a provision that any intellectual property developed by the beneficiary remains their personal property, even if assigned to the company. It's a relatively standard protection for inventors and technical founders. My heart started racing. What does that mean? It means you own the patents, not TechFlow Innovations. The company may have an exclusive license to use them, but the underlying ownership never transferred. Pharmatech thinks they're buying $38 million worth of intellectual property that David doesn't actually own. The legal strategy that emerged over the next few days was elegant in its simplicity. We would let David proceed with the acquisition negotiations, allowing him to make increasingly specific representations about the company's assets and intellectual property holdings. The further he went down that path, the more legally exposed he would become when the truth emerged. Hawthorne explained the strategy during our second meeting at his downtown office, a space that spoke of old Seattle money, mahogany paneling, Persian rugs, and windows that framed Elliott Bay like expensive paintings. "David is walking into a legal trap," he said, spreading documents across his conference table. "Every representation he makes to Pharmatech about owning your intellectual property becomes potential evidence of fraud. Every certification he signs about clear title to company assets becomes a potential felony." Meanwhile, I quietly filed provisional patent applications for several improvements to the MetaSyst algorithm that I'd been developing in my spare time. These weren't just minor updates, they were fundamental enhancements that would make the current system obsolete within months. The genetic integration breakthrough Harold had mentioned in his letter was just the beginning. I'd been developing a complete next-generation platform that would revolutionize medical AI. The new patents covered everything from advanced machine learning architectures to real-time biological marker analysis to predictive modeling for treatment outcomes. If David wanted to play hardball with intellectual property, I'd show him what that game looked like when played by someone who actually understood the technology. But the patents were only part of the strategy. Hawthorne had discovered that David's acquisition negotiations with Pharmatech included specific warranties about employee retention and technical capability. He's promised them that the core development team will remain with the company, Hawthorne explained. If that team leaves, particularly if they leave to join a competitor, Pharmatech can void the acquisition and demand penalty payments. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to actively recruit anyone. Word was already spreading through the Seattle tech community about what had happened at TechFlow. Miguel Santos called me the day after my termination, ostensibly to ask about references, but really to express his outrage at David's actions. Jenny Morrison sent a LinkedIn message that carefully avoided explicit job discussions, but made it clear she was exploring new opportunities. The real breakthrough came when Sarah called. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding new opportunities. I may have some information that would be relevant to any future endeavors you might be considering." We met at a coffee shop in Fremont, far from downtown and the potential eyes and ears of TechFlow employees. Sarah arrived carrying a laptop bag and wearing the kind of nervous expression that suggested she was about to cross lines she'd never crossed before. "I've been David's assistant for 4 years," she said without preamble. "I've seen his emails, heard his phone calls, organized his calendar. Marcus, the Pharmatech deal isn't what he's telling people it is." She pulled out printouts of email exchanges between David and Pharmatech executives. As I read, my understanding of the betrayal expanded beyond personal hurt into something approaching awe at David's duplicity. He hadn't just stolen my company, he'd been planning it for over a year. "Look at this email from 8 months ago," Sarah said, pointing to a message from David to Pharmatech's acquisition team. "He's already discussing the possibility of removing you from the company to streamline operations. He told them you were brilliant but difficult to work with, that your perfectionism was slowing down product development." The emails painted a picture of systematic manipulation. David had been feeding Pharmatech carefully crafted narratives about my supposedly difficult personality, about the need for stronger business leadership, about the benefits of acquired the technology without the baggage of the original technical founder. He'd positioned my removal not as a betrayal, but as a necessary business evolution. "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling out additional documents. "David has been negotiating a personal consulting contract with Pharmatech that would pay him $2 million over 3 years to help integrate MetaSyst into their existing product line. Essentially, he gets paid twice, once for selling the company, once for helping them use what he sold." The scope of the planning was breathtaking. David had orchestrated not just my removal, but his own enrichment, positioning himself as indispensable to Pharmatech while making me appear expendable. It was a masterclass in corporate manipulation that would have impressed me if I weren't the victim. "Sarah," I said carefully, "why are you showing me this?" Her laugh was bitter. "Because I've worked for you both for 4 years, and I know which one of you actually created the technology that makes this company valuable. David's good at talking, but you're the one who built everything that matters." Pharmatech thinks they're buying a proven AI platform. What they're really buying is a bunch of code that only works because you understand how to make it work. She was right, and that gave me the final piece of my revenge strategy. 3 weeks later, Hawthorne called with news that the Pharmatech deal was moving to final approval. David had signed personal guarantees about the validity of the patent transfers, and Pharmatech had committed to a closing date just 10 days away. "It's time," Hawthorne said. "Are you ready?" I was more than ready. I was looking forward to it. The law offices of Blackstone, Morris & Associates occupied an entire floor of a downtown high-rise, all marble and mahogany designed to intimidate. I'd requested the meeting, ostensibly to discuss settlement of my employment termination and confidentiality agreement. David and his lawyers expected me to grovel for a few additional months of severance pay. They were wrong. I arrived with Hawthorne and a briefcase full of documents that would change everything. David was already seated at the conference table, flanked by Blackstone and Morton, their expressions ranging from bored to mildly annoyed. They clearly considered this meeting a waste of time. "Mr. Chen," Blackstone began, "I trust you've had time to reconsider our previous conversation. The severance offer we extended was quite generous, and the confidentiality terms are non-negotiable." "Actually," I replied, "I'm here about a different matter entirely." I slid a document across the table, the trust agreement Harold had established years earlier. David picked it up, his face shifting from confusion to comprehension to something approaching panic as he read. "What is this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "It's a trust document," Hawthorne explained, establishing Mr. Chen as the beneficial owner of 15% of TechFlow Innovations. The trust was created by your father and has been in effect since the company's incorporation. Blackstone grabbed the document, scanning it quickly. His professional composure began to crack as he reached the key provisions. "This is impossible. Our due diligence showed Mr. Perag Sterling as the sole majority shareholder." "Your due diligence was incomplete," Hawthorne said smoothly. "The trust was established as a private family arrangement and wasn't required to be disclosed in corporate filings. However, it does have certain rights and protections that are now relevant." David's face had gone pale. "You can't use this to block the acquisition. Pharmatech is counting on this deal." "I'm not here to block anything," I said. "I'm here to discuss the patent ownership issues that might complicate your sale." Morton leaned forward. "What patent ownership issues?" I slid another document across the table, a legal opinion from a respected intellectual property firm detailing the ownership status of the Metasist patents. The conclusions were devastating. Under the terms of Harold's trust, any intellectual property I'd developed remained my personal property, regardless of corporate assignments. "This is ridiculous," David sputtered. "The patents are clearly owned by the company. Marcus assigned them when we incorporated." "Actually," Hawthorne said, "he couldn't assign them because the trust agreement prohibited such assignments without trustee approval. Any purported assignment would be void as beyond his authority." Blackstone was studying the patent opinion, his expression growing darker by the page. "Even if this is accurate," he said finally, "the company has been using these patents for years. That establishes an implied license." "A revocable license," I corrected, "which I'm now revoking, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at me across the table like I was a stranger, which in many ways I suppose I was. The Marcus he'd betrayed had been trusting, naive, willing to put family above business. The Marcus sitting across from him now had learned to play the game by David's rules. "What do you want?" David asked finally. "I want justice," I said. "I want the company back. I want you to explain to Pharmatech why the deal they thought they were getting doesn't actually exist. The patents aren't the entire company value. Morton interjected. There are other assets, customer relationships, physical property. True, Hawthorne agreed. But Pharmatech's offer allocated $38 million specifically to the patent portfolio. Without those patents, the deal becomes much less attractive. Over the next 2 hours, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Pharmatech had structured their acquisition as an asset purchase specifically to acquire our intellectual property. Without clear title to the patents, the entire deal would collapse. Worse, David had made personal representations about the company's asset ownership that would expose him to fraud claims if the patents weren't actually transferable. There has to be a solution, David said, desperation creeping into his voice. Marcus, we can work something out. A licensing agreement, royalty payments, something that lets the deal proceed. I pretended to consider the offer. What kind of licensing terms were you thinking? Reasonable terms, market rates, 5% of revenues, maybe 10%. Interesting. I opened my briefcase and pulled out one final document, because I've been thinking about licensing too. In fact, I've already filed provisional patents for the next generation of MedAssist technology, improvements that will make your current system obsolete within 6 months. David's face went white as he read the patent applications. The improvements weren't just incremental. They represented a fundamental advancement that would revolutionize medical AI diagnostics. Any company trying to compete in the market would need to license my new technology or be left behind. You can't do this, David whispered. This will destroy the company. 47 people will lose their jobs. 46 people, I corrected. I've already been fired, remember? The meeting ended with no resolution. David and his lawyers needed time to assess their options, which were rapidly diminishing. Pharmatech would want answers about the patent issues, and those answers would likely sink the acquisition deal. I left the law office feeling something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Not just for revenge, though that was certainly part of it, but for the possibility of rebuilding something better from the ashes of what David had destroyed. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Sarah, my former assistant. Marcus, she said, I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I thought you should know. David's been calling emergency meetings all morning. People are scared. What kind of meetings? Legal meetings, HR meetings. There are rumors that the Pharmatech deal is in trouble. Some people are already updating their resumes. I felt a pang of guilt for the innocent employees caught in the crossfire, but I pushed it aside. David had created this situation when he chose greed over loyalty. If the company collapsed, that was his responsibility, not mine. Sarah, I said, if anyone asks where they might send their resumes, you can mention that I'm considering starting a new company, a company that would value the kind of talented, loyal people I used to work with. The next phase of my plan was already taking shape. With my new patents and Harold's trust fund as seed capital, I could launch a competing company within months. The same employees David had used against me could become the foundation of his destruction. Pharmatech pulled out of the acquisition deal 3 days later, citing material misrepresentations regarding intellectual property ownership. Their withdrawal triggered penalty clauses that cost TechFlow $2 million in deal fees and expenses. David called me that evening, his voice hollow with defeat. Congratulations, he said. You won. The deal is dead. The company is hemorrhaging money, and half our staff is looking for new jobs. I hope you're satisfied. I'm not satisfied, I replied. I'm just getting started. What do you mean? I mean I'm launching a new company. MedTech Solutions will specialize in next-generation AI diagnostics, using proprietary algorithms that make MedAssist look like a pocket calculator. There was a long silence. You're going to put us out of business. I'm going to do what you did to me, I said. I'm going to win. 6 months later, MedTech Solutions had signed its first major client, MedCorp International, the same company that had been preparing to award their contract to TechFlow before David's betrayal. Our new AI diagnostic system was everything MedAssist had promised to be and more, with accuracy rates approaching 99% and processing speeds that left the competition irrelevant. The irony wasn't lost on me. MedCorp's CEO, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, no relation to the politician, had called personally to discuss the contract. "We were disappointed when TechFlow couldn't deliver on their promises," she'd said during our first meeting. "But from what we've seen of your technology, MedTech Solutions represents the future we'd been hoping for." What she didn't know was that I'd spent those 6 months not just rebuilding the company, but rebuilding the technology from the ground up. The new MedAssist platform incorporated everything I'd learned from 4 years of real-world implementation, plus advances in machine learning that hadn't existed when David and I first started coding in his garage. Miguel Santos had been my first hire, followed quickly by Jenny Morrison and 12 other key employees from the original TechFlow team. Sarah had come aboard as my executive assistant, bringing with her an institutional knowledge of our client relationships that proved invaluable during the transition. "It feels like the old days," Miguel had said during one of our late-night coding sessions, "except now we're building something that's actually ours." He was right. There was an energy in the new office, a converted warehouse in South Lake Union, that reminded me of the early excitement David and I had shared. But this time, there were no hidden agendas, no secret negotiations, no questions about who owned what. The equity structure was transparent, the decision-making process was democratic, and everyone who contributed to our success shared in the rewards. TechFlow Innovations filed for bankruptcy protection 2 weeks after we announced the MedCorp contract. David had burned through the company's remaining capital trying to develop competing technology, but without the core patents or the engineering talent that had built the original system, his efforts were doomed from the start. The bankruptcy filing made front-page news in the Seattle Times business section. "Tech startup falls from grace after founder exodus," read the headline, accompanied by a photo of David leaving the federal courthouse after the filing. He looked older, defeated, wearing the same expensive suit he'd worn to our confrontation at Blackstone's office, now somehow looking cheap and ill-fitting. "I bought TechFlow's remaining assets at the bankruptcy auction for $12 million, a fraction of what Pharmatech had been willing to pay for the whole company. The acquisition gave me access to our old client list and eliminated the last potential competition in the medical AI space." The auction was held in a sterile conference room downtown, attended by a handful of potential bidders and the court-appointed trustee overseeing the bankruptcy proceedings. David attended, sitting in the back row like a ghost haunting his own funeral. When the gavel fell, awarding me ownership of the company we'd built together, he stood and walked out without a word. But not before our eyes met for a final time. In that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger or resentment, but what looked almost like relief. As if the burden of maintaining his charade had finally been lifted, as if admitting defeat was somehow easier than continuing to pretend he'd been the driving force behind our success. That night, my mother called to congratulate me on the acquisition. "I'm proud of you," she said. "You turned a terrible situation into something positive." "Did I?" I asked. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just as ruthless as David was." "There's a difference," Rebecca replied. "David destroyed something to benefit himself. You rebuilt something to benefit everyone, your employees, your clients, the patients who will receive better care because of your technology." She was right, but the victory still felt hollow. I'd won the war, but at the cost of becoming someone I didn't entirely recognize. The naive trust that had made me vulnerable to David's betrayal was gone, replaced by a calculating pragmatism that served me well in business, but left me feeling isolated in ways I was still learning to understand. A year later, MedTech Solutions went public in one of the largest IPOs in healthcare technology history. Our market valuation reached $400 million on the first day of trading, making me one of the youngest self-made millionaires in the Pacific Northwest. The opening bell ceremony at NASDAQ was surreal. Standing in Times Square, surrounded by employees who had believed in the vision even when everything seemed lost, watching our stock symbol MTS flash across the digital displays that dominated the urban canyon around us. Rebecca had flown in from Seattle for the occasion, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son ring the opening bell. "Harold would be so proud," she whispered as the trading day began, and our stock price immediately jumped 30% above the offering price. I used part of the proceeds to establish the Harold Sterling Foundation for Medical Innovation, a nonprofit organization that provides grants to researchers developing AI applications for healthcare. It seemed fitting that Harold's secret trust, which had saved my company, should be honored through a foundation that would help other innovators avoid the pitfalls that had nearly destroyed me. The foundation's first grant went to a team at the University of Washington developing AI tools for early cancer detection. Standing in the university's medical school, presenting a check to researchers who reminded me of my younger self, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the early days with David, the pure joy of building something meaningful. David never tried to contact me again after the bankruptcy auction. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd moved to California and was working as a sales manager for a mid-sized tech firm. No longer the charismatic entrepreneur who could charm investors and close million-dollar deals, but a middle manager grinding out quarterly reports and sales forecasts. Occasionally, I'd see updates about him on LinkedIn, promotions to senior sales manager, posts about meeting quotas, the gradual transformation from visionary founder to corporate employee. Part of me felt sorry for him. Part of me felt he'd gotten exactly what he deserved. Both parts were probably right. The rain was falling again on the day I moved into my new corner office, 42 floors above downtown Seattle. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the building that had once housed TechFlow Innovations, now converted to generic office space for companies that would never change the world. From this height, the city spread out like a circuit board, all gleaming towers and connecting streets, pulsing with the energy of ambition and innovation. The Space Needle stood like a retro-futuristic monument to optimism, while Elliott Bay stretched toward the Olympic Mountains, their peaks disappearing into the perpetual cloud cover that defined the Pacific Northwest. I thought about the Marcus Chen who had stood at different windows 2 years earlier, watching the rain and dreaming of the future. That man had believed in partnership, in family, in the naive notion that good intentions were enough to protect you from the wolves. This Marcus Chen knew better. This Marcus Chen had learned that in business, as in nature, predators respect only strength. Trust was earned through verification, not granted through blood relation. Family was a luxury you could afford only after you'd built walls strong enough to keep out the enemies who shared your name. But this Marcus Chen had also learned something else, that rebuilding could be more satisfying than building, that second chances could be better than first ones, that sometimes betrayal was just life's way of forcing you to become the person you were meant to be all along. My assistant knocked on the door. Jennifer, a brilliant young woman who reminded me of Sarah, but with sharper edges, harder eyes, the kind of person who would never be surprised by betrayal because she'd learned early that everyone was capable of it. "The MedCorp executives are here for the quarterly review," she said. "Conference room 3. I straightened my tie and picked up the quarterly reports that showed record revenues, expanding market share, and technology advances that kept us years ahead of any potential competition. The numbers told a story of unqualified success, of a company built on solid foundations and growing stronger every quarter. They didn't tell the story of what it had cost to build those foundations, or what I'd become in the process of laying them. But in business, as David had taught me, results were the only truth that mattered. The quarterly meeting went smoothly, as they always did now. MedCorp's executives were pleased with our progress, excited about the new features we were developing, confident in our ability to revolutionize healthcare AI. Dr. Warren shook my hand as they prepared to leave, her grip firm and professional. "Marcus," she said, "I want you to know that choosing MedTech Solutions was one of the best decisions we've made. Your technology is saving lives every day." After they left, I returned to my office and stood again at the windows, watching the Seattle afternoon fade into evening. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, each one representing dreams and ambitions, successes and failures, the endless human drama of building and destroying and rebuilding again. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Dinner Sunday? I'm making Harold's favorite pot roast." I typed back, "Wouldn't miss it." Family, I'd learned, wasn't just about blood or marriage certificates or shared last names. Family was about choosing to show up, about protecting the people who would protect you, about building something together that was stronger than what any individual could build alone. David had been my stepbrother, but Harold had been my father in all the ways that mattered. Rebecca had been my mother, but the employees who had followed me from TechFlow to MedTech were my chosen family now. Miguel, Sarah, Jenny, and 43 others who had bet their careers on my ability to rebuild something better from the ashes of betrayal. I walked toward the conference room, past offices filled with brilliant engineers and ambitious managers, past windows that framed a city full of dreamers and schemers, past the ghosts of trust and innocence I'd buried to survive. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for whatever came next. But this time, I was ready for whatever storms might come. This time, I had built something strong enough to weather any betrayal, smart enough to see threats before they became fatal, and valuable enough to attract loyalty from people who understood the difference between partnership and ownership. Outside, Seattle pulsed with the rhythm of innovation and ambition, the eternal cycle of creation and destruction that defined the modern economy. Somewhere in this city, other partnerships were forming, other dreams were taking shape, other trust was being built and broken. But in this office, 42 floors above the chaos, Marcus Chen had learned to separate trust from verification, hope from naivety, family from blood. It had cost him a brother, but it had gained him an empire. The rain continued to fall, washing everything clean for tomorrow.